for what I think will be a really enlightening webinar, which is called How Will EU DORA Affect Fintech in 2025? And I'm delighted to be joining with me some superb experts from the world of fintech, AI, and legal. So I'd like to start off by introducing Luis Lancos, who's an entrepreneur and founder of an agentic platform called Data Whisper. Nice to see you, Luis. Oh, I can't hear him. You're on mute.
Yeah, the joys of a remote discussion.
And also lovely to see you. And we've got Jonathan Armstrong, and Jonathan is a partner at Punter at Southall. So lovely to see you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Gordon.
And then lastly, but by no means least, Thomas Radosh, who's a co-founder and CTO of Deployflow. Lovely to see you here.
Likewise, thank you for hosting us.
It's a pleasure. We thought just for those of you that are joining us, we will be having about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for Q&A. But please feel free, if you're hearing some interesting insights from our speakers, do use the chat accordingly, because if there's things that you're saying that we can bring into the conversation earlier, then I absolutely will. I thought we would start actually, if I may, with a poll just before we get into a deep dive, which is, how is DORA important to your business? So I think my colleague Sonia is going to launch a poll, and it'd be really interesting to see some of the insights that come up with that. Sonia, are you able to launch the poll for us? Well, assuming she's going to be doing that fairly soon. The reason I think it's quite interesting, in fact, that's what we'll do. We'll while she's doing this, I want to ask a more open question to all of you, which is, why should fintech companies really do care about DORA, and what are some of the immediate implications? Perhaps if I start that with you, Thomas, what's your thoughts?
I think, with the way that the technology recently have moved to utilize heavily the cloud and utilize the space in kind of more adventurous way. When we think of the fintech, we often been thinking of the traditional banking industry with very strict regulation, but there's a lot of startups, a lot of new innovation coming into that place, and they pushing the boundaries of the technology. But the challenge with it is that because they're pushing those boundaries often have some security challenges. I think the best example, I know Lou is going to be touching on that, is the whole AI space. It's an amazing tool, can be used to deliver amazing things, but how do you make sure that the AI and the language models that it relies on does not have proprietary information or confidential information that you host of your customer or details of the code that can then be used outside. So building that security from regulatory perspective really puts a right controls and measures for organization to start utilizing and pushing in the right direction, not just the technology, but security with it.
And that's a really interesting point, isn't it, Jonathan? But because from a security point of view, there are challenges. Why do you think they should care about it?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few reasons. I agree with what Thomas has said. I mean, I think you have to look at DORA as part of a whole package of measures. So regulators and legislators are getting more concerned about operational resilience, about cybersecurity, about risk. And so you've got to look at DORA in context of NIS2, elements of the EU AI Act, bits of GDPR that are part of that whole package of governments caring about this stuff. And then to fintech particularly, I think that there's often a perception that fintech organizations are sort of Johnny-come-latelys and don't have the same systems and processes in place. And I think DORA will be where the rubber hits the road for many of those. It's almost a sign of maturity if you can adapt to frameworks like DORA. So there's competitive advantage there in complying. There's competitive disadvantage in not complying, because obviously a lot of your customers, if you're a fintech, will be sending you these mind-numbing, ridiculous questionnaires. They won't be reading the answers, but the more of those answers you can read and demonstrate compliance with, the more likely you are to get business as well. So there's fundamental reasons from a sort of defense perspective. You know, you're avoiding litigation, you're avoiding reputational damage, you're avoiding litigation in investigations and fines. But you're also proactively demonstrating that you're doing your best to secure your operations against the threats that are out there.
100%. Really points well made. Lewis, what's your thoughts around this?
I basically agree with Thomas and with Jonathan. First and foremost, I think we have to think that is a regulatory, and there is no way that we can go around, and includes all the space around financial services, but also includes ICT companies or technology service companies that are serving the financial services, right, within EU. So first and foremost, I think it's mandatory. The other aspect I would like to highlight is that it's actually not totally new, in the sense that if you merge the ISO 27001, the information security standard, and the ISO 22301 for business continuity, most of the time DORA builds from it, right? So it's actually built on standards that exist. And I think it tries to harmonize this space across all the financial services.
Yeah.
The aspect that we'll have here is that for fintechs, I think there will be a question on how to optimize the resources and what the level of automation that we can to drive DORA, because DORA can be quite extensive, and that's probably will be the conversation. The other interesting aspect, and I work in AI, so obviously I'm really interested, is there are two phases of AI regarding this DORA and this type of regulations. One is how DORA affects AI itself, right, and building AI. And the other one is how AI can help to automate process and can help to make more cost effective and speed up the process of implementing and running DORA. Right?
Yeah, great points. I don't know if we're able to share that poll. Are we at all on why is DORA important to your business? Have we got any joy with that at all? Maybe we haven't.
We can see the poll here on the chat. If you
we can see it in the chat, can we?
Yes,
right.
Yes. So yeah, 75% at the moment, what I can see here is managing third-party risks. 25%
there we go. Fine.
keeping up the rules. Yeah.
Perfect. Great. I was thinking it was going to come on the main screen. Interesting. Do you want to comment on that, Thomas?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, the managing the third-party risk. I think this is the first legislation requirement that comes in that really puts the pressure on identifying your suppliers. It's no longer just, do you have the contract in place for you to be protected? Is it, does your supplier does the thing according to the DORA challenges? And I think this creates a big challenge for organization. I think, Jonathan here can probably speak a lot about his upcoming a lot of work and assessments of those contracts, but it helps that most of organizations going to be working with one of the leading cloud providers, like of AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. But so you would hope that they have the right legislation compliance in place already. But as we were saying, the startups tend to push. They push the technology, they push the opportunities, the solutions, and when they push those items, it is going to create this additional work that you have to accommodate for. So we're not talking just about the technical challenges, but we're talking about this legislative challenge of making sure that your partners, your providers, having the right items in place for you.
No, absolutely.
I think, Gordon, I was just going to say, I think one really important aspect here is that people have to look intelligently at third-party risk as well. And I think if I look at the data breaches, we handle, let's say 40 data breaches a year, ballpark, on behalf of clients. And I would say probably about 75% of those are third-party breaches at the moment. They're really challenging to handle because either you've got a big provider, that might be a cloud provider, it might be a payroll provider, somebody like that, who's been breached or been subject to ransomware attack, and they're not very good at communicating and are inflexible. Or you've got a small provider, and again, it could be a critical service, but relatively low value, and they get into an absolute tailspin where they can't help you in connection with regulatory reports, stopping the damage, etc. And so you get into a difficult situation already under GDPR, where usually you don't get any meaningful data from the supplier until about day 7, day 8, day 9, but you've got a reporting obligation on day 3. So a lot of reports we're giving to regulators on behalf of clients at the moment, between us, are sometimes almost meaningless because you haven't got enough information. You've got no information from the third-party supplier to make it meaningful. But at the same time, regulators are, I think, looking sometimes at reporting as a competitive sport. If you've got a supplier, let's say the Capita breach, to make it relevant to financial services, you've got maybe, let's say, 200 pension funds affected, then regulators are looking at which of those pension funds are curious enough to get information to be able to report it. And if you've reported less or you've researched less than a peer, then you're already under the spotlight for your processes not having been good enough. So I think the 80% of people who are concentrating on third-party risk are probably putting effort into the right area, but you've got to look at that intelligently. I know a lot of organizations look at supplier risk in terms of contract value, which is nearly always wrong. Nearly always it's the low value contracts that cause you the most harm for the reasons I've already outlined. So people have to look really intelligently at that risk as part of their DORA program.
I mean, I think what you're saying is they're going to take more personal responsibility, haven't they, about this as much as anything else?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Absolutely right.
And Jonathan, I think you make a really good point, and that has to do with two aspects. I think that is very important to look. One is an appropriated classification of the risk of the incidents, what type of incidents are major or not. And two, in terms of the classification of assets, I mean, where we really need to put the effort in terms of monitoring. And even in the case of third parties, even if it's small, it may actually deliver some critical asset or some critical service. And we really need to put some particular attention there, right? How you balance those things, right?
Really good points, Lewis, as well. I want to talk a little bit about compliance now, because I think this is such a really, really important part, isn't it? And I guess coming back to you, Jonathan, more than anything else, how important, what sort of steps do you think organizations should have, maybe almost as a compliant checklist around DORA?
Yeah, I mean, I think it obviously always starts with a gap analysis. As Lewis has rightly said, some people will have done this stuff already. Some people will have done this stuff because they're already financial services regulated. I agree with Lewis as well that the difficulty is going to be for some tech providers because they haven't been in a regulatory regime like this before. But the gap analysis piece is important. I would probably then look at training. I think you've got to train the organization as a whole, but particularly train senior management. I think that the episodes that I've been involved with have shown that organizations are getting better at training the bottom of the organization and possibly getting worse at training the top. You know, the phishing attacks that I see, for example, they're nearly always COO, CEO level that are clicking on phishing links from the attacks I'm seeing, not junior members of staff. And a lot of organizations aren't brave enough to sit the board down and make them do training and awareness sessions. And a lot of boards aren't fit for purpose either in terms of looking at operational resilience because they don't have cybersecurity experts on the board. So I think that's a thing that people have to be brave and step up and do. They're obviously going to have to look at processes and procedures. One key element of DORA is looking at realistic risks. That's obviously a bugbear of mine with things like phishing attacks. We still train people how to spot Nigerian scam emails where they're not the type of thing that's going to bring the organization down. And we don't train them to spot the unusual. We train them what the unusual looks like, and we normally get it wrong. So you have to do things like proper horizon scanning. Again, DORA's building on programs like CBEST that have been in the financial services community for years to look at realistic scenarios that might bring the organization into disrepute. As I've said, you need to look at the board composition as well as training them. Obviously, third-party risk we've talked about already. There's a very complicated bit on working out who your regulator will be. Relatively easy for established financial services organizations, extremely difficult for technology providers because that's going to depend almost on who your customer's regulator is. And that's a whole spider's web that you'll have to walk across. And then I guess the last bit I'd say would be robust testing. You've got to test your processes and procedures. I'm a great fan of doing simulations. We've maybe taken 350, 400 individuals through data breach simulations. You get better the more you do. And DORA's a little bit like, I don't know, air accident awareness in that there has to be a loop as well. If you have an episode or a simulation and you highlight a gap in your processes, you go and fix that and you loop back around again. So just as in the air traffic world, we're looking at incidents and near misses, I think that's a really good mindset to have with DORA as well.
Really, really good. Anything that either of you want to add to what Jonathan was saying before I move on?
Yeah, I'm just going to add, I think what you have kind of highlighted, and I think that's important for people to understand. We're thinking of DORA as impacting the financial service because it's aimed at that. But the DORA is aimed at the financial organization and the technical providers. So, when we kind of separate the two sometimes, the technical providers have to be conscious, have to put those items in place. And, when you mention kind of the cycle of training and improving, that's what DevOps really is about. We have this infinity wheel in the DevOps, which has got the continuous improvement as part of it. And I think, the mindset and the kind of the technology space that has a lot of that embedded inside that now need to make sure that the security is really embedded and seen all the way through. We've seen a lot of organizations that building a very compelling and strong CI/CD pipelines that are great at delivering, releasing the software quickly. But often they do miss the security checklist, the security assessment of the code, of the changes. There are tools out there that you can utilize to help you do that. But it's something that, it extends into the technical provider space a lot more dramatically, which forces them to start looking at what they're offering and how they're offering what they're doing at the moment.
It's a really good point, actually, because it's just before I think sometimes you get this sense that organizations operate in silos, and that includes technology. And I think if there's something that is so important to hear is all the stakeholders need to come together and make sure all of the checks and balances have been done and in place. But Lewis, you want to comment?
Yeah. I just want just to highlight a couple of points. And the first one is actually I'm looking at the pool, and 80% are referring the third-party risk. And there is one aspect that I think we should probably have some talk, which is many of the suppliers that these organizations have actually sits outside of EU, either in America or in other regions, and they not necessarily go through DORA, or they are necessarily under DORA, which then highlights how the process and how we monitor these third parties. I think it's very relevant to ensure that we have something in place that is robust to monitor these vendors, that especially they are not under DORA constraints, right? And it needs to marry within the DORA. And that leads me to my second point, that is monitoring. If we look in terms of resilience and then incidents, DORA focus a lot about how we do incident response, and actually has a timeline that's 3 days to report and so on and so on. But I think it's very, very important to have the ability to monitor the critical assets. And the monitor we divide in two. One, we monitor the critical assets, and that implies that we need to have in place a robust inventory for IT assets, and that's something that I know by experience is extremely complicated to have, and scales as the complexity of the organization goes. This is it becomes. But then identify what are really the critical resources, and what I would think is the ability to actually have active monitoring. And here is, for instance, an area that AI can absolutely help, but monitor the behavior of these resources and to anticipate anomalies and jump. So have a bit of proactive and preventive action here. But that monitoring should apply as well to other assets, to controls that we have in place in DORA, but also to third parties, and probably focus on the highest critical points. I found it always challenging to have effectively monitoring tools and monitoring things in place, because most of the times it's a process, very formal process to have, but actually we need to have tools that they do this monitoring and continuity to be actually effective. So I wanted to bring this to the discussion, because I think it's one of the most difficult areas I came across.
No, and absolutely, it sort of leads us into a nice segue into AI, really, because I think it's a really exciting space that we're in now. But I mean, I guess, in what ways do you find, Lewis, AI can help fintech companies implement DORA efficiently? Before I ask you to answer that question, because we do have another poll that we're going to post, which is an AI poll. Be good to...
Gordon, we do have as well a question in the chat. Might be worth addressing that next as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. This is from Vickers, I think. We're going to have a checklist to cover ISO 27K, ISO 22, DORA, and CRA in 3 years, a step-by-step guide to navigate across all 4. So, again, that looks really, really interesting. Also, do folks see the 4 converging, or one encompassing the other 3? Yeah. I mean, any thoughts on the question that's just been raised? Did you want to comment on that, Thomas, before I?
I wanted to comment on the second question, talking about the overlapping of those. And while ISO 27, 22, and DORA, there are things that they overlap, but there's things that one pay more attention to, and I don't think that there's one that kind of have all of them. And I think there's a reason as well. When we're thinking about the ISO 27K, we are talking about the security aspect of the organization as the whole, but we're looking at the security of the processes. We're looking at more employee, kind of what Jonathan was mentioning, training, getting them to kind of get used to systems. Whereas DORA is now concentrating more, as I mentioned, on your supplier more than it is even on the organization. The organizations, most of them will have good security practices in-house, but they might not extend that to check the third party. So I think each one of them is, I think either one of them you can start with to get yourself certified, because they will each complement and will help you to lower the amount of work you need with the next one. But I don't think either one of them is kind of covering the whole thing. They all have their distinct areas of effort and concentration on that only slightly overlaps between. So that's my view on that.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. Just moving on to our poll then. I don't think everybody has responded, but I think it just gives us a bit of a snapshot here. I guess there's no surprise to find out that risk assessment is one of the how can AI help your company with compliance? Yeah, risk assessment being at the top of that list, along with security monitoring, which you've already highlighted, Lewis. What's your role? What's your thoughts then about AI in the fintech company space, particularly when it comes to DORA?
Me?
Yeah, sorry, Lewis. Yeah.
Okay, cool. First and foremost, I do think that, especially looking at fintechs, because the biggest organizations, they can throw a lot of human resources into these problems, right? The fintech, it has two challenges. One is to be compliant and has constraint of the resources, and the other one, the biggest compliant, is that the fintech needs to move very fast in the market, and it needs to ensure that implements the regulatory in such a way that it doesn't really stop development. It doesn't stop delivering new features and new products. And that is sometimes a challenge, right? And that has to do how we do. And always keep in my mind that automation is a key part of this equation. And the question is how we do automation, how is possible to do automation. And of course, I work in AI precisely because of this. And I believe there is a lot we can do. And the pool already highlights some of the key areas. But if I try to think about where AI can sit and actually can help, and from AI, I'm actually talking about generative AI and machine learning all together, and as well agentic frameworks and AI agents. It's becoming a big part of the conversation, and it's important that we understand what they can bring to the game and where they sit, right? So if I look where we can bring, I would start by saying that even it creates the roadmap for DORA and to identify gaps. So the regulatory mapping and gap analysis is something that absolutely AI can help. And also identify and look at internal policies and map them and assess the risk of these internal policies in DORA against the regulatory, and identify again the gaps on policies. I think it's something that it's not particularly difficult and can be done. The ICT, the risk register, absolutely, to automate and to look AI to identify risk identification and analysis. I think it's an area that absolutely can be used. Here, we can actually adopt AI agents and agentic workflows to continuously monitor those risks. And highlight every time we have. I think it could be a really interesting proposal and a really interesting use case for AI agents. Gordon, you're gonna have to stop me when it is, because
yeah, absolutely, yeah, I know.
I have a full list in my head. Yeah, so okay. Let me just give some more points. monitor DORA controls. It's absolutely important that we have key aspects in terms of what controls we have in place. And then just instead of relying on committee to monitor these controls, we actually would make sense to implement mechanisms, and again, using potentially AI agents here to analyze these controls and the behavior of these controls. Cybersecurity, obviously, and there are a few tools in the market that start to look at these risks. And on the cybersecurity, I also would say that when we look at the inventory management, to have AI, and here machine learning can help in conjunction with generative AI, but having tools that can look at the critical assets and then baseline those assets and then look for disruption patterns and highlight this in real time, that can effectively go a long way. And of course, and this what we could call critical asset management monitoring, I think it should be in place in an area that can help. Also, incident management and response, it could effectively help to produce the reports. And DORA creates a kind of degradé of reports where you have the initial report that you need to submit in 3 days, and then you have the follow-up report. And some of the more detailed reports are quite painful to build because the amount of information that needs to grab from the organization, from the various systems that were involved, can be a huge amount of work. So having AI to try to facilitate this and at least preparing first drafts of these reports can accelerate the process, can absolutely ensure that you don't have so many resources just jumping on it.
Amazing.
And
yeah.
A third part, risk management, I think AI, it's huge from the contract analysis and to highlight the risks there to the monitoring of the third parties. And I'm going to stop here. I still have a lot, but I'm going to stop here. So we kick off the conversation.
No, it's good. It's good content, and obviously, just another reminder to everybody: do put your questions in the chat. I mean, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, but do put them in there. I want to launch our last poll actually, which is which legal aspect of DORA is most critical for your company. So we should be getting that in a minute. It'd be really interesting to see, Thomas, about this. And I guess a question for all of you, but I'm going to start with you, Thomas. Considering both DORA and the EU AI Act, how can fintech companies streamline their compliance efforts to handle overlapping areas effectively?
I think it's as I was mentioning, between all of those different regulation, you have those overlapping aspects of them, and you have to, by driving one, you're already getting yourself partway with the other. And right. I think it's kind of the importance of the DORA for the financial markets comes that, you have to be compliant comes January. If we're talking about DORA now, but, it's been 2 years that's kind of been, in place and being talked about, but it's only now that people kind of, as it tend to be with things, things get pushed back and like we'll get to it until you're told, well, you got 3 weeks or 4 weeks to get yourself compliant. So I think EU AI Act is still kind of a little bit less defined, and therefore you need to concentrate on the DORA, and you have to kind of push forward with that, because that will get you already a part way there. If you're not ISO 27001 compliant, having DORA will already get you a lot of the items that are required as part of the ISO. ISO covers, your vendor management. The ISO 27001 vendor management aspect gets enhanced by DORA. It doesn't get necessarily rewritten or changed. So if you have that inside DORA and you don't have the ISO 27001, when you have to define this, you already have a very well-defined process. But if it's the other way around, you already have the well-defined steps that you can utilize in DORA, and you just improve. So I think when it comes to those overlapping, you need to know what's the key driver for your organization. And, as Lewis mentioned, there are opportunities within the AI space to help. Not all of them are there yet, not all of the functionality. When we're talking, there was a question in the QA, actually, how can the models be tested for compliance within and mitigating those standards? Those are the questions we still need to answer. Those are the items that still going to be refined. As we know, AI space, language models, they get continuously enhanced, improved by providing more and better information. So we know that we might not necessarily be covering all of this aspect with it, but we are getting there. We are on the way there to improve, and that's kind of the driver here.
No, really, points well made. I mean, Jonathan, interesting to see that third-party contracts, business continuity and security rank highly in the sort of poll. I know we haven't got a huge number of responses, but is that and data privacy at 18%? What's your thoughts around what Thomas was saying, but more broadly around the EU Act and its implications?
Yeah, I think I agree with most of that. I think a lot of businesses will have processes and procedures in place that they can adapt. I think Lewis is right. AI can help with that. They'll have things, if they've done things like GDPR well, they'll already have a data breach plan in place. That'll need to be adapted, because obviously with DORA, we're talking more about operational resilience, not necessarily personal data. So they'll need to adapt their plan, and obviously the reporting lines are going to be different, et cetera, et cetera. But it'll get them 80% of the way there. Equally, if they did the ROPA, Article 30 records under GDPR, records of processing activity, if they did that well, they'll be able to adapt that to help with DORA compliance. So as well as ISO standards, they should have other legal frameworks and processes and procedures that you can adapt. But bear in mind, we've only got 48 days, and that's assuming you're prepared to work New Year's Eve, Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, if they're things that you celebrate. So there isn't a lot of time. And I think regulators will want to see people making a conscious effort. Will they, as midnight strikes on the 17th of January, will they be prosecuting people? Will they be fining people? Right. Probably not. But I think we'll need to make a conscious effort. And obviously, the first event that happens afterwards, DORA will come into play. And I think I understand what Lewis was saying about tech suppliers that were outside the EU, but there'll be a real appetite from regulators to discipline them as well. Absolutely. So you can't think, oh, we're using AWS, and AWS are a US corporation, so we can forget DORA compliance as far as our hosting is concerned. Absolutely not. I think that in some respects that will be worse, because regulators will expect you to discipline non-EU suppliers more heavily, and there will be an appetite to bring non-EU suppliers under the magnifying glass as well. Just as you've seen with GDPR, I'd estimate off the top of my head, we're probably around about, don't quote me on this, 1.8 billion euros worth of fines as we sit here today. I would say 1.6 billion euros are US-owned corporations, or non-EU-owned corporations. There's all sorts of political reasons why that's going to be the case, but you need to look at that third-party risk, as people are saying, and it will involve boring things like contracts. It will involve audit rights. It will look at looking at indemnity provisions, reporting timelines, all of that stuff that, frankly, even lawyers find dull, but they're the hard yards that you're going to have to go through in the next 48 days if you haven't already.
Do you think we need a sort of a showcase or landmark decision to help, like rattle the cage? Because I always think compliance and regulation is only as good as the enforcement behind it. I mean, we saw that, of course, with GDPR, didn't we? And then there was some big fines taken by some of the big organisation, and it made people feel very, oh God, we've got to get this sorted out. But had there not been that level of publicity, I think there were people that were still breaking the regulations, and ignorance, of course, is no excuse for non-compliance, is it?
Yeah, I think that's correct. And I think we will get some showpiece incidents where DORA comes into play. I don't think we'll get necessarily quick resolutions. But I think one other thing to lose sight of, perhaps, is that as well as saying that DORA fits in with a raft of EU regulations, of course, it's not just in isolation. The UK's regime changes in March next year as well. And we've already had regulators using existing powers. I talked about Capita already, where regulators were all over that pretty quickly. You could look at TSB, for example, when they had an outage as they switched systems. I think that was a turning point in terms of UK regulation. You know, if you look at the numbers, a fine of more than 48 million, more than 32 million in redress to customers, and then personal fines against the CIO. So I think we do get these high watermarks where, you know, total cost to the bank is probably north of 100 million. And some of these things are relatively minor issues. You know, one episode, I think, was just a cleaner coming in, unplugging a server to plug in the vacuum cleaner, which leads to outage. So some of these episodes are quite hard to prevent, which is why organizations need to look at when, not if, an incident will happen, and get muscle memory in terms of their response plan and how they exercise that and how they go across to regulators to plead for mercy.
Yeah, wow, goodness me.
I'll just, there's a good question that Vikas just posted as well about, you know, do FS org in UK only, do they need to comply with DORA? And I just wanted to say this, that, you know, DORA is a EU regulation, but the same as we saw with the GDPR, you know, GDPR came in EU and it starts to be rolled out all around the world. Each of the countries gets their own slightly tweaked version, but the foundational protection of the individuals are retained going within. So while we do not have DORA, if you only UK, there are specific regulations within the UK, and I would not be surprised if we were to adopt the DORA within the UK law in the very near future anyway, because you will see that the benefit will come in place.
And Thomas,
it comes in on the 31st of March. So it's not, there's only a 2-month window roughly between EU DORA and the UK equivalent. And the other important thing to remember is that it's some aspects of it are based on location of the users, not the location of the provider. So if you're a UK tech provider, but you're supplying financial services organizations that operate in the EU financial services market, then you still come under DORA, whether you're in Brussels or in Birmingham. So you're absolutely right that most legislation like this is designed for extraterritorial reach. And if you look at the fundamental thing behind it is to look at effectively critical national infrastructure. That's what NIS2 is doing. That's what DORA is doing. So because infrastructure tends to be global these days, because there's a concentrated power in the hands of few providers, then all of this legislation is meant to be, if you like, a land grab to regulate the effect of providers globally on people in the EU. And the UK regulations are very, very similar as well when they come in March.
Good stuff.
I think what was just to notice, and absolutely, I think it's awesome conversation. But DORA doesn't come alone. I just want to highlight this, and everyone knows, right? But DORA doesn't come alone because we have GDPR And if he's relevant, if you are in payments, you have PSD2, and you have the PCI DSS 4.0, or the SWIFT self-assessment. You have all these that are mandatory. So I would like to highlight the fact that whatever tools, whatever framework we put in place, it needs to have a wider consideration in terms of the whole frameworks, because many of them require active monitoring, and they have a lot of intersections. So I think it's worth to put all together and see where are the intersection points, where are the commonality, and how we can really drive things, right?
Mm-hmm. No, really good points, all of you. We sort of said that we would wrap up now initially in terms of the discussion, but we can carry on because I really wanted to bring some Q&A. So I know there's a number of you here. Please do just pop a question in the chat so that
we have Q&A section as well, Gordon.
Q&A section is a separate area, isn't it? Yeah.
We have two questions in there as well.
Whereabouts is that actually? Am I missing that on the Teams?
On the top of the screen.
You see Q&A.
All right. Okay. Where do I see Q&A?
Where you have chat and where you see the people, the number of people.
Right, number of people, and where is
in between? There's a Q&A button.
There isn't on mine.
Well, we can read those questions now.
Can you read those?
Yes,
it's not on my.
The first story incident.
If only we had an IT support on the call. Okay, so the first one was, what strategies can small and mid-sized businesses adopt to ensure compliance without stretching resources? I think it's a very good question.
Yeah, and who wants to answer it?
Can I kick off? I just want to drop a quick two thoughts. If I look at the small company, as I was saying, or smaller companies, the challenge is how you become regulatory compliant and you continue to do it, continue to maintain that compliance while continue to innovate, because otherwise you are dead in water in the market. And that's always something that I'm always worried. And my thought, that's why I put so much stress in automation. It's that how much we can automate, what is viable here to automate and to be practical, because it's the only way to reduce the burden. And then the second aspect is partners. What partners, consultants, like people like Jonathan, or in DevOps, people like Thomas, that can actually step in and help to do that while maintaining the key resources of the organization. And we need to consider that the core business of a fintech, it's not regulatory, right? And sometimes when we achieve a certain level of demand on the regulatory, it's almost changes. And I did experience that, right? So it's how we keep the focus on the core principles, the core of the organization, while we drive organization.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to that, 100% agree with what Lewis said, is there's only that much you can do in-house. There's only that much resources that you can allocate to the specific task. That's why having the right partners at the table that you can talk to, that you can lean on the experience and expertise, makes the whole journey a lot easier. Like nobody goes and does the ISO certification on their own. They work with the partners, the organization that helps you, because that's what they do day in, day out. And as Lewis mentioned, you have to identify what's your core business, what's your core value, what you can deliver, and concentrate on that and work with the right partners who are DORA compliant and help you along this way.
Absolutely.
I agree with that, but since it's my job as a lawyer to challenge things, the one thing I would challenge is the resources. From my experience, if you can explain, that's why I'm saying early in your process, do the board engagement, do the management engagement, because your pot of resources might not be finite. If they realize the issues and realize that this legislation brings personal liabilities for them as well, then you might find that your pot of gold gets increased.
And I think that's the key point you said is you have to get the whole organization on board with it, because a lot of the time the items are just being done in a technical bubble. The CIO and the CTO and the technical team deliver something, but this is a organization-wide impacting item that everyone has to be on board with.
Yeah, I mean, just to give you a really interesting, well, I think moderately interesting story. I spoke at 2 conferences, one day after the other, one for CIOs and one for heads of compliance. At the heads of compliance conference, I said, who do you think is responsible for DORA in your organization? The majority of them said the CIO. At the CIO conference, I said, who do you think is responsible for DORA in your organization? The majority said the chief compliance officer. So everybody is still, I think, to an extent, pointing the finger at each other. And that's why you need to get together at board senior management level to work out whose responsibility it is and put some money against that responsibility as well.
Have we got any more Q&A? Because it's not showing up on mine. Is there any
There's
more questions?
one more, which is how can AI models be tested for compliance with DORA resilience standards, especially regarding continuity and risk mitigation? I think, Lewis, that's something for you.
That's actually a very tough question, right? Yeah. So
Lewis,
a couple
stuck
of points
for words.
here. No, I'm just thinking because it's a really a good question, and it has to do because as we adopt generative AI and we look at these agentic frameworks and we have generative AI and we have large models and we train, it's a really good question how we guarantee that the models when they look and test compliance are really reliable, right? And this touch points in some key aspects within these models, things like hallucinations and how we reduce that, right? A couple of points here. First and foremost, I think we need to have structures of AI governance in place, right? There are mechanisms at this moment that create observability, transparency on these models, and that in real time they are effectively testing the models against some key factors, right? So that is one part of the response. I'm not going into detail, but they are quite extensive. They try to detect from hallucinations to the relevance of the response of the model along the time to performance of the models. That would be my first point, and I would strong advise when adopting these technologies to ensure that there is coupled with that observability in place and governance in place of these models that create that assurance. And they also will need to discuss with the regulators, because that question that was made here in the chat, it will be the same question that will be raised by the regulators for sure, right? You are using AI to do this. How you are manage the risk of AI itself? And that's a very big question and will become a bigger and bigger question as we move forward. So the second aspect is if you fine-tune models or train models, it has to do obviously with the quality of the data and more important, the preparation of that data that you have for training, right? And the ability, and I think it's not just the preparation of the training data, but then to have some form of validation of the results of the training, the test of that data, and that includes typically humans to do part of that validation. So governance, and then ensure that the training data is adequate. My third point is very important, is human in the loop. And I'm not saying this because EU Act, AI Act says that, but actually it's very important. it's incredibly important, especially when creating AI process and mixing with AI agents to automate process. It's incredibly important that we understand where we need to bring the human on the loop. At this stage, I would not allow the AI to make critical decisions. And I give an example. Imagine that we are applying this to prepare the incident reports and submit to the regulator. I would never allow AI at the moment just to kick off and submit the report to the regulator and make that decision. Also, we can do that automation. It would be very unwise, right? That's what I would do in this case, just to illustrate, is that I would have AI collect, pre-prepare reports, suggest reports, even analyze gaps, whatever it is, and mitigation actions. All that is fine. But then I would absolutely have a human to review the report, to approve, and to make the final decision. AI then can submit and can monitor the response from the regulator and all that stuff, but we need to be aware. So this probably would be my third point, and actually one of the strongest is don't try to automate. If you're talking about workflows, don't try to automate when go. Plan very careful where human in the loop needs to be to precisely manage and minimize the risk. And of course, you will have to respond if something go wrong. So not having the human in the loop in the right place, it will take into a bad conversation with the regulator, right?
Absolutely. Great points, Lewis. Thank you so much. And we've almost reached the end of our webinar. I just really want to finish with final thoughts from you all, really, particularly around sort of the future. What's the future going to look like with regard to compliance in the fintech space, and what you think is coming down the line? We sort of touched on some of it already, but really a sort of a short summary on what you think is going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. Perhaps Jonathan to start, then Thomas, and then finally Lewis.
The pace of change is huge. I've been doing this for 30 years. It's probably the busiest 12 months we're going to have. So get used to change. And then maybe the other thing slightly worrying is personal liability is a real key point. So regulators are focusing on that. They know that making examples of executives makes corporations comply. We've seen that with the Abarca case I talked about. We've seen it with Joe Sullivan, with Tim Brown in the US. This is a trend that's coming over here. So make sure that A, you comply, and B, that you're insured against not complying.
Right. Thank you. Thomas.
Yeah, I think Jonathan raised a very good point. But from my perspective, I think this is just showing that finally the governments and the legislative organizations starting to catch up with the technology. I think for years we've seen kind of disconnection. The legislation was about 5-10 years behind the technology. We still had to deal with, do you have a tape backup somewhere of the systems? But now the DORA and the AI regulation, they're coming in, they staying kind of very close to the technology world. So the challenge is going to become more complex because in this unregulated space, we now having a regulation that comes in, and none of that is very complicated. I believe most of the organization and people even here on this call, we doing most of the things required in place. There's just the tweaking that has to be done, that you just need to get the understanding and address your processes accordingly. I think that's the opportunity and challenge here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Thomas. And Lewis, a shortened version.
Shortened version is very simple. I think we will see the increase of regulatory. A lot is happening regulatory across the world. We'll see a dramatic change in technology that on one side will make things easier, but the other side will bring other challenges to the regulatory landscape. And I want to be provocative at the end. I actually think we will enter in a very interesting space where regulators will start to compete with each other because at the moment we see regulators imposing regulatory, but now we'll see America trying to say, well, we're going to deregulate, and that will drive competitive. So we will see a kind of marketplace for regulators, and I'm very interested to understand what that will mean. Right?
That's amazing. Lovely. Guys, thank you so much for taking the time out on Friday to talk about what I think is a really, really fascinating subject. And for those of you that are watching this, do connect with each and every one of them on LinkedIn, and I'm sure there's going to be further information that will follow out afterwards. But for now, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you as well.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure, everyone.